Dajahao Tongzhimin, and welcome back to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution podcast with your host, Drew Smith, finally back in the recording studio at last. It's so good to be back here after 4 months of being on hiatus. Goodness, 4 months. Life got kind of crazy there for me for a while, but I'm back, moved from Xi'an to Beijing, and I'm ready to start a new chapter in life. And a new chapter in the podcast. All right, so last time in our story, we stopped at the last week of July 1971, when Premier Zhou Enlai had just wrapped up his first meeting with U.S. Secretary of State, or then National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, and the U.S. national ping-pong team's tour of China marked the beginning of a new relationship between China and America. So, let's pick back up on our story on August 1st, 1971, Army Day, the anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army in 1927. That day, all major newspapers shared an editorial marking the day, as they always did each August 1st, and called for the People's Militia to be built up for both defense and economic construction. In Beijing, at the Great Hall of the People, the Party Center hosted an Army Day banquet for top civil and military officials, along with dignitaries from fraternal Maoist parties from around the world. The next day, on the other side of the Pacific, U.S. President Richard Nixon dropped a big one. He announced that the USA would support the People's Republic of China being represented with a seat at the UN, but still set the terms that Taiwan, the Republic of China, would still get a seat at the UN too. In a veiled response, People's Daily attacked the, quote, illegal occupation by U.S. imperialism of the southern half of Korea, unquote, and predicted a U.S. attack on the DPRK. Xinhua news agency was just as direct, criticizing Nixon's proposal to seat both the PRC and ROC at the UN as a clumsy two-China's trick. Nixon replied to both the Chinese and American press diplomatically, saying that, quote, China may become the world's most powerful nation and that peace depends on our two great superpowers talking. Negotiations with sworn enemies wasn't just happening with the USA during that week. On August 5th, Vice Minister for Foreign Trade, Zhou Huamin, flew to Moscow to sign an agreement with his Soviet counterpart for exchange of goods and payments. Sino-Soviet trade really had never stopped, even during the 1969 border conflict, but this would definitely lubricate the flow of goods and services between the PRC and USSR in a big way. Still, of course, the Chinese made no bones that negotiation with the Americans and Soviets didn't mean capitulation. On the 7th, Xinhua news agency put out a statement in support of the Black Panther Party and other black communist and nationalist formations, saying that there was an increasingly important role of black workers' revolutionary struggles to defeat the USA's working class. That same day, a government statement said that big powers cannot monopolize nuclear weapons and called for the USA and USSR to adopt a no first-use policy. That same day, over yonder in Lhasa, the Tibetan Administrative Party Congress opened. The main political report was given not by Revolutionary Committee head Zheng Yongya, but his fellow General Ren Rong. A few days later, the Tibetan Party Congress ended with the election of a new party committee led by Ren Rong, who displaced Zheng Yongya and who went on to serve in Shenyang, far up in the northeast. For more information on that, see our episode on Tibet and Xinjiang during the Cultural Revolution. On August 9th, Zhou Enlai was interviewed by New York Times journalist James Reston. Zhou and Reston had a very good conversation, and oddly, Zhou praised the New York Times for opposing the invasion of Cambodia. Speaking of newspapers, the next day, People's Daily shared a curious story. PLA Hospital number 165's account of relying on Mao thought to cure mental illness over standard psychiatric methods. The article explained how a doctor cured a severely depressed patient by living on the ward with her and reading her Mao quotes. I mean, I will say, Mao quotes do make me feel pretty inspired, so maybe there's something to it. On August 12th, Mao called for a National People's Congress after National Day, and the Politburo assigned Zhang Chongqiao, Li Desheng, and Ji Donghui to arrange it. 2 days later, Li Desheng flew to Albania at the head of a military friendship delegation. Then, on August 15th, amidst a rainstorm, American Maoist William Hinton arrived back for the first time in Longbo Village, whose 1940s land reform campaign he wrote about in his famous book, Fan Shen. And if you've never read his book, Fan Shen, Documentary of Revolution in a Chinese Village, well, honestly, do yourself a favor and turn this episode and start reading it right now, because you can't understand the Chinese Revolution fully and deeply without reading Fan Shen. Anyways, let's get back to the buildup of the main story, the one you guys are here for today. On August 15th, accompanied by Wang Dongxing, Mao left Beijing on his official private train for his regular summer inspection tour around the South. The 1971 Southern tour is key to the incident we're talking about today, so we definitely have to get into it. The next day, by the way, the Nanjing Revolutionary Committee convened a meeting to start reviewing the personnel files of potential girlfriends for Lin Biao's son, Lin Liguo, who was still single and looking for marriage. Anyways, that day, Mao arrived in Wuhan, greeted by Hubei's secretary Lu Feng. In his meeting with Lu, he immediately set about criticizing Chen Boda and Lin Biao due to their behavior at the Lushan conference in September of last year. Recounting the conference's debate on whether or not Mao was a genius, Mao criticized Lin Biao for praising him to the point of absurd hyperbole that implicitly diminished Marx and Lenin. Mao said he was tired of the cult of personality around him and that Lin was preventing him from scaling it back. Mao also complained that Lin had prevented efforts to cultivate a new generation of leaders after Mao died. Indeed, Mao felt that if Lin had his way, the People's Republic would die with Mao, or at least with Lin. On that same day, Zhou Enlai, Zhang Chongqiao, Ji Donghui, and Huang Yongsheng visited Lin Biao in Beidaihe to brief him on plans for a National People's Congress. And then the crew all went to see China and Iran's ambassadors to Pakistan sign a mutual recognition agreement, asserting the PRC government as the sole government of China. The next day, Hunan's leaders joined Mao in Wuhan. Mao told the Hunan provincial delegation that the Lushan plenum was a failed power grab by people who expected him to die soon. Since the Lushan surprise attack, as he said, Mao thought that he was now paying close attention to the PLA, although did not think it could rebel against him. On August 25th, Hunan leader and central government agricultural official Hua Guofang visited Mao, who questioned him over why he was still wearing a Mao badge. Mao went on to tell Hua Guofang that those who pushed the genius issue to attack Zhang Chongqiao were actually attacking him. "I am not a genius," he said. Mao went on to say those who thought about the genius theory as being an infallible truth were waving the banner of Mao Zedong to oppose Mao Zedong. Mao warned Hua that, as they had seen across 1967 and 1968, factionalism gets people killed, and comrades in the party should work to prevent that from happening again, while still continuing revolution under the revolution. He went on to say that people should not be killed in struggle, criticism, transformation, and provocatively said that there will still be struggle and contradiction under communism. On August 27th, before leaving Wuhan, Mao told Lu Feng that he wanted to continue mixing in sand by giving Li Xianyan a Central Military Commission job. Then, on the train to Changsha, Mao got his attendants and officials to sing the Internationale and explained the completely Marxist lyrics. After another sing-along of the 3 rules of discipline and 8 points of attention, Mao's train arrived in Changsha. Officials then visited him aboard. Mao recounted to them the histories of the party's line struggles and, turning to Hua Guofang, sang a reprise of the 3 rules of discipline and 8 points of attention. Mao went on to reminisce about line struggle and Ye Jianying proving his mettle on the Long March with clandestine work against the Zhongguo-Tao line. The next day, talks continued in Changsha. Hinting at senior Air Force officers fawning over Lin Li Guo, Mao said that it didn't help someone in his 20s to be called a super genius. Mao asked Sichuan leader Lu Xingyuan and Guangzhou PLA head Ding Sheng, what are you going to do if he were to oust their old boss, Wang Yongsheng? Mao then told Wang Dongxing that at some point he should convey to the Politburo the main points that he made on his tour of the South. On August 30th, another meeting was convened of regional party authorities with Mao. Mao said that Liu Shan was different from the party's previous line struggles. Lin Biao never owned up to his part in it due to his status. Although he insisted that Lin Biao must continue to be protected, Mao blamed Lin's people for the whole kerfluffle. He also told the regional leaders not to discuss Liu Shan openly yet. Mao reminded the comrades that genius comes not from any gifted individual or group of individuals, but from a party which is a vanguard of the proletariat. On August 31st, Wang Dongxing flew to Nanjing ahead of Mao's train to brief Xu Xiao and others on Mao's conversations with officials so far this trip. Mao received Xu Xiao in the evening. Mao asked Xu bluntly why it was that he and Nanchang uprising leaders who created the People's Liberation Army no longer commanded it. Meanwhile, on September 1st, Enver Hoxha politely invited a Communist Party of China delegation to the coming Party of Labor of Albania Congress, following his August 6th letter lecturing Mao about Nixon. Anyways, that same day in Nanchang, the capital of Jiangxi province, Mao received regional commanders Xu Xiao, Han Xianchu, and Cheng Shiqing, and then proceeded to criticize Lin Biao and the generals close to him. Meanwhile, back in Hebei province, Lin Biao curiously and nervously told his head of security that there was no point in him having plans for a new residence built at Beidai because, he said, quote, I do not have much time to live. What did he mean by this? On September 3rd, Mao arrived in Hangzhou and received regional commanders Nanping and Xiong Yingtang, as well as Chen Liyuan and Bai Chongshan from the Air Force. Mao upbraided Chen Liyuan for following Wu Faxian at the Lushan plenum last year, asking, what were you up to? Chen was too shocked to answer. Declaring that the Lushan incident was not over yet, Mao told the officers that he was now taking a close interest in the running of the PLA. Complaining that there are statues and portraits of him everywhere, Mao reiterated his thoughts on the personality cult from a few days before, saying that it was time to cool down the personality propaganda. 2 days later, Lin Li Guo's quick in the Air Force contacted Guangzhou Air Force officer Gu Tongzhou and learned of Mao's recent comments on Lin Biao, which enraged Lin Jr. Lu Feng leaked to Li Zuopeng that Mao considered the Lushan split unresolved, and Li immediately flew to Beijing and informed Huang Yongsheng, who then telephoned Lin Biao's wife, Ye Chun. On September 6, Nanjing authorities' quest to find a suitable girlfriend for Lin Guo was called off, as Lin Jr. had become engaged to a 20-year-old army musician named Zhang Ning. That same day, Lin Biao's daughter, Lin Li Heng, as well as her fiancé Zhang Qinglin and Lin Li Guo's fiancé Zhang Ning, were all summoned to Beidai He. Lin's children and their partners all arrived at the Lin family homestead to find their father unshaven and shaking nervously. Zhang later recounted being shocked at how sick he looked. Lin Li Guo then told his sister Li Heng that Mao was moving against Lin Biao over the Lushan split and drew parallels to Peng De Huai. 2 days later, Lin Li Guo left Beidai He for Beijing for a dentist's appointment. Lin Li Heng, with her brother gone, told members of Lin Biao's staff that she was worried that Lin Jr. was going to try to do something politically drastic and bring her father into it, but she wasn't exactly sure of what. The staff brushed her off, saying she was just being paranoid. That night, Ye Chun stayed up all night crying to Lin Biao. She told him that she expected him to be purged and sent to the countryside because Mao thought she and him were spies. Back in Beijing, Lin Liguo met with Zhou Yuqi and other members of his Air Force clique at a suburban airfield. They talked late into the night and then agreed to meet again tomorrow, though their discussion was strictly confidential. The next day, Lin Li Hung and her fiancé took Lin Liguo's fiancé sightseeing, brought back a toy soldier as a souvenir for Lin Biao, which she enjoyed. Meanwhile, Mao decided to abruptly leave Hangzhou for Shanghai. While on the train, Mao approved Zhou Enlai's request for a plenum of the Central Committee that month to elect Ji Pengfei and to expel Chen Boda from the party. Upon arriving in Shanghai, Mao summoned Wang Hongwen and Shu Xiu to his train. Shu was uncontactable, so Wang turned up alone, and Mao then sent him away. The day afterward, Wang Hongwen and Shu Xiu visited Mao together. Mao criticized Shu for going off to the countryside the day before without leaving any way to be contacted. Nanjing's Air Force political commissar and Lin Liguo associate Wang Weiguo, who Mao criticized a few days before, tried to get on the train with them but was denied entry. Mao left Shanghai just after midday on his special train and went straight to Beijing. Almost instantly, Wang Weiguo informed Lin Liguo by telephone that Mao was heading back to the capital. On September 12th, the day started off tense. At Beijing Fengtai Station, Mao received Jin Dongfei, Li Desheng, and Wu Da, and told them that Liu Shan's black hand was not just Chen Boda. Wu Da self-criticized for signing Chen Boda's genius briefing. Mao reassured him that he bears no guilt, but Wu remained petrified. Jiang Qing visited Beijing's summer palace to relax and brought 4 melons, which, she was proud to announce, were a gift from Lin Biao. Meanwhile, back at the Lin house, Ye Chun suddenly told her daughter Lin Li Hung and her fiancé that they were to get married that evening. Shocked and confused, they argued her down to an engagement party. Lin Liguo then told his sister Li Hung that the situation was fraught in Beijing and that he was either going to go to Dalian, Guangzhou, or even Hong Kong. It seemed that dirty work was afoot. Lin Liguo and Zhou Yuqi told their clique in the Air Force that Lin Biao was going to fly to Guangzhou tomorrow and address the nation for a special announcement. That night, Lin Biao took his sleeping pills and went to bed. After her husband was asleep, Ye Chun told the rest of the household to get ready to go to Guangzhou early tomorrow. Lin Li Hung discreetly informed guards that Ye Chun intended to fly the family out of Beidai He for Guangzhou early tomorrow morning. The guards, concerned, reported this immediately to Zhongnanhai. Things escalated across the night. The Central Guards Bureau telephoned Zhou Enlai, who was in a late-night meeting at the Great Hall of the People, to tell him that Lin Liguo had taken a Trident 1E aircraft from Beijing to near Beidaihe. Wang Dongxing reported to Zhou Enlai that Lin Li Hung feared that her brother was up to something, possibly attempting to kidnap her father. Ye Chun called Zhou shortly afterward, explaining to him that Lin Biao needed a plane to visit Dalian. Zhou Enlai felt something was amiss and told her that it wasn't safe to fly that night. Zhou promised to come to Beidaihe to smooth any problems personally with Lin Biao, but Ye Chun told him not to because it would upset Lin. She then hung up abruptly. Under a different number, Trident 1E aircraft number 256 was dispatched to the airfield serving Beidaihe. Zhou asked Wu Faxian if he had sent an airliner to Beidaihe's local airport. Wu said no, and said that there was no such plane there. Wu called around to his comrades, and Air Force officer Hu Ping told Wu Faxian that he sent the Trident to Beidaihe as a test flight after repairs, and thought that this would be trivial. Hu Ping called Wu Faishan back a few minutes later and said that he couldn't send the trident back to Beijing, as Wu instructed that the engine was now broken. Sensing something was now certainly wrong, Zhou told Li Zuopeng to ensure that the trident did not take off without the combined approval of 4 officials, including himself. Li guessed that Zhou was alluding to Lin Biao and named him when repeating and re-repeating Zhou's orders back to confirm them. The Politburo continued on across the night, discussing the upcoming National People's Congress. Afterwards, Zhou asked Huang Yongsheng to stay up and help with the suspicious plane. Meanwhile, at Beidaihe's small airport, a PLA air traffic controller was awoken and told to manage a Trident plane to take off without his team. According to his testimony later, he suspected it was a nuclear mission against the Soviets. Then the clock struck midnight. Ye Chun and Lin Liguo awakened Lin Biao, who was completely whacked out on sleeping pills, and dressed him and set him off for the airport. Lin Biao's head of security fled the group, wanting no part in whatever was going on. While in the car, Lin asked his wife and son if they could head to Irkutsk in Siberia, and asked how long it would take to get there. Upon arrival at the airport, PLA guards admitted Lin Liguo's car into the compound. Li Zuopeng gave his approval over the phone for the Trident to take off. Lin Liguo and Yu Chun boarded the waiting Trident airliner, while soldiers watched on in confusion. Lin Biao was too drowsy and weak and had to be hauled up into the plane. Some witnesses even later claimed that Lin was struggling to not get on the plane and was openly weeping. After the marshal and vice chairman was on the plane, some of the Trident crew ran towards the plane before the engine started, leaving Lin Liguo, Ye Chun, and Lin Biao aboard with a pilot and 5 others. The plane revved its engines and slowly, surely, into the black of the night, began to creep away from the gate and towards the runway. The troops on the ground at the airport tried to block the Trident's takeoff with their vehicles, but the plane weaved around them, but clipped one, damaging the wing of the plane. One soldier claimed to have heard gunshots coming from inside the plane, suggesting that a struggle had begun to take place on board. Beidaihe's airport's captain of the PLA Guard garrison arrived at the airport to find that Lin Biao's plane was already on the runway and getting ready to taxi. The Trident then sped down the runway and took off, flying westward into the darkness. Li Zuopeng reported to Zhou Enlai that Lin Biao's plane had managed to take off, despite attempts to stop it. Zhou told him to track it. Wu Faishan then called Zhou and said that he had forbidden the Trident plane to take off no matter who asked, but Zhou replied that the plane was already airborne. Wu ordered several planes to be ready to fly Zhou to wherever Lin Biao landed so that he could speak with him face to face. Zhou then ran to Mao's residence at Zhongnanhai and found that Mao was still awake, taking a late-night swim in his swimming pool. He pressed Mao over whether to send fighters to intercept Lin Biao. Mao got out of the pool, looking legitimately shocked. As he sat on his sofa next to his swimming pool, Mao simply said, "No, let him go. Lin Biao is still vice chairman of the party. Rain will fall, women will get married. What can we do? Let him go." Wu reported to Zhou and Mao that the plane was 100 kilometers from entering Mongolia, but was hard to track by radar, flying unusually low to the ground. Now, while the details are unclear, according to reports, the damaged wing on Lin Biao's plane caught fire sometime shortly after they had entered Mongolian airspace. The pilot changed routes, seeming to try to turn backwards towards China, but it was too late. The Trident was going down and exploded upon impact in the depths of the Mongolian desert. Lin Biao, Ye Chun, Lin Liguo, and 6 others in the crew died in the burning wreckage immediately upon impact. And thus, Lin Biao, the hero of the Chinese Civil War, one of the grand marshals of the revolution, vice chairman of the Communist Party of China, grand marshal of the People's Liberation Army, and Mao's appointed successor, close comrade in arms, the second in command of the great proletarian cultural revolution, was dead. Mao, looking genuinely hurt and devastated, told Zhou to convene the Politburo immediately. At 3 a.m., Zhou Enlai briefed the Politburo and said that, in his estimation, Lin Biao had defected to the Soviet Union, or at least tried to. Meanwhile, Lin Liguo's allies, Zhou Yuqi, Yu Xinye, and Li Weixin raced into the darkness onto a helicopter outside Beijing and took off with 2 bewildered crew. With Zhou Yuchu reported airborne, Mao was moved from his swimming pool residence off to the Great Hall of the People, well protected from air attack. Zhou Enlai banned all aircraft from Beijing and grounded all flights from Capital International Airport. He gave the order that Air Force ground forces were to shoot down anything approaching the capital. Zhou then called for the deployment of Army infantry battalions to all airfields, both civilian and military. An hour later, Zhou expanded the ban and grounded all aircraft nationwide and sent Central Guards Officer Yang Dezhong to Wu Fashan at Beijing Shijiao Airport to assist him. Li Xianyan, Hua Guofang, and Li Deshang were dispatched to the PLA's temporary HQ in the Jingxi Hotel to assist them, too. Meanwhile, in the air, a fighter passed over Zhou Yuqi's helicopter. Zhou's pilot turned back, protesting that Mongolia was out of range and that they would be shot down. Air Force fighters searched the darkness for Zhou Yuqi's helicopter, but lacked suitable radars. A ground station picked it up, headed back towards Beijing, but Beijing air defense gunners refused an order to fire at the helicopter, fearing collateral damage. Zhou Enlai telephoned and agreed that they should not open fire. Zhou Yuqi's uncooperative, reluctant pilot then tried to overpower Zhou, who shot him dead. The helicopter landed safely in a cornfield north of Beijing, where they were surrounded by a local People's Militia squadron. Zhou Yuqi, Yu Xinye, and Li Weixin then entered a suicide pact. On the count of 3, the men put their handguns to their head and killed themselves before the militia could put them in handcuffs. Sun rose over China that morning, with the people of China being none the wiser that their beloved vice chairman, Chairman Mao's closest comrade-in-arms, was now dead. At 9 a.m., Zhou Enlai telephoned Lin Liheng, Lin's daughter, and they spoke for about an hour. She testified to the premier that Lin Liguo deceived their father into getting on the plane. Meanwhile, PLA signals intelligence intercepted Mongolian military transmissions saying that an airplane from China had illegally entered their airspace, then caught fire and crashed. Mongolian People's Republic authorities arrived at the crash and identified Lin Liguo's body from his ID card. The rest of them were crispy critters, as we would say, so they could only basically assume who was who. Zhou Enlai reported to Mao that Mongolia seemed to think that the plane was indeed carrying Lin Biao and that it had crashed the night before, but was warned that it might be a deception. Around noon, Chen Boda was taken to Beijing's notorious Qincheng prison and housed alone in building number 204 with round-the-clock observation by 2 sentries. Zhou Enlai convened the Politburo again in the afternoon, augmented by PLA leaders. They drafted emergency instructions to the armed forces. Zhou then rang all provincial and local military leaders to tell them that Lin Biao had fled and to put all armed forces into emergency readiness. The next morning, September 14th, the Mongolian government lodged a protest with China that a military plane had entered Mongolian airspace and crashed in the desert. After 50 straight hours of being awake, Zhou Enlai finally got some sleep. However, he was unfortunately soon woken for an embassy report that nobody had survived the crash. A drugged and woozy Zhou Enlai repeated, "Crashed to death," to himself and made himself presentable before going to report to the chairman. Zhou was asked by Mao how it could be that the Trident crashed into open ground and suggested that perhaps it had ran out of fuel or had gotten lost. Mao, despondent and melancholic, sat down at his desk. He wrote a letter to the whole party in which he called Chen Boda a sham Marxist who believed in the genius theory at the expense of learning from the masses. Mao's letter called for a party-wide discussion and criticism of Chen Boda's conspiratorial activities, and noted, oddly, that Lin Biao concurred with him. Wang Dongxing sent additional security to Beidaihe to protect Lin Liheng against reprisals from any remaining Lin conspirators. An acting foreign minister, Ji Pengfei, was informed that Lin Biao was dead, causing him to explain that they all died in a plane crash. What a marvelous ending. What the legitimate fuck? The next morning, soldiers scoured Lin Biao's quarters at Beidaihe and began searching his papers and sending them to Beijing, care of the General Party office. Xu Shiyou visited Zhou Enlai in Beijing, who gave him the task of discreetly arresting 4 of Lin Liguo's suspected accomplices in the PLA. Summoned to Beijing, Wang Hongwen was then tasked with luring Shanghai's public security chief, Wang Guiguo, away from his men to be arrested safely. Wang Hongwen casually invited Wang Guiguo to Shanghai's Jinjiang Hotel to review a document. Wang Guiguo asked him to read it over the phone. Explaining that the document was confidential, Wang Hongwen told Wang Guiguo that the review would be quick and promised to take him to a seafood dinner. Wang Guiguo entered the Jinjiang Hotel conference room to find that Wang Hongwen was not there. Instead, soldiers arrested him at gunpoint. On the afternoon of September 17th, Mao and Zhou agreed upon the main points of an internal verdict on Lin Biao, classifying it as a line struggle and tying him to Chen Boda. The next day, Radio Xinjiang, still obviously having not gotten the memo, just like the rest of the country, welcomed Mao and Lin Biao's outstanding good health and advertised a new photo album of the pair available for sale in Urumqi. Mao then approved Zhou setting up a working group to investigate a Lin Biao-Chen Boda conspiracy, led by Ji Denghui and Deputy Wang Hongwen. Zhou Enlai chaired the Politburo that night, showing photographs of Lin Biao and Ye Chun's charred skeletons. The Politburo agreed to disseminate an official verdict on Lin by Zhang Chengchao and Yao Wenyan, listing 16 historical mistakes, but were told to hold off on releasing it to the public. The Politburo put the Air Force under the command of a 5-man group of officers, sidelining Wu Faxian, who declared his resolute support. A top-secret internal party circular charged Lin Biao with treason and revealed the fatal renegade escape of the bourgeois careerist. The Lin Biao circular presented Lin Biao as opposing Mao throughout the 1930s and 40s, and he had been a rightist the whole time. On September 20th, Zhejiang leader Nan Ping sent his deputy Chen Liyun to Shanghai's Jinjiang Hotel to view a document. Inside, Wang Hongwen arrested him, just like Wang Guiguo. Wang Hongwen asked the soldiers to be gentle with Chen Liyun as he was taken away, and in a Shanghai basement, he was interrogated about Lin Liguo. The next day, the Chinese government told all foreign embassies that there would be no National Day parade, despite earlier rehearsals, because it would be a waste of time and money. This caused French media to speculate that either Mao was seriously ill or that a party congress or National People's Congress might be coming up. The foreign ministry assured the French that Mao was not dead, but offered no specific explanation for National Day's cancellation and several days of grounded flights. Marshal Chen Yi, off from official duties with advanced bowel cancer, was briefed about Lin Biao's death and began formulating a criticism. On September 22nd, the New York Times reported that Lin Biao's status as successor was being questioned by some elements and speculated that Lin might have been ill. Back in Beijing, PLA Chief of Staff Huang Yongsheng briefed bureau chiefs on Lin Biao's flight and death. Access to the September 18th circular remained tight. Zhou then interviewed embassy staffer Sun Yishan, who photographed Lin Biao's crash site. Sun claimed that he saw evidence of a missile blast. When Zhou asked Sun if he had collected papers out of the wreckage, Sun said no. Zhou was enraged, exclaiming that a party member must defend state secrets to the death. On September 23rd, the New York Times suggested that either Mao or Lin may have died, with unusual troop movements since September 12th being signs of a possible succession crisis. The next day, Wu Fashan was called to a meeting in the Great Hall of the People. Before leaving, he warned his wife that there may be a chance he would not return. Zhou Enlai announced to the Politburo that Generals Wang Yongsheng, Li Zuopeng, Wu Faxiang, and Chu Huizhuo had all been relieved of duty. The four generals were then placed under investigation over their links to Lin and told to write self-criticisms under house arrest. But, meanwhile, there was something happy going on. At the UNHQ in NYC, China's Albanian comrades submitted a resolution to the UN to restore the People's Republic of China to all of its rights and expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. So yeah, Albania was at the UN doing China a solid while all this was going on. But anyways, on September 26, a central directive informed the public that there would be no National Day parade in the capital this year, but smaller local celebrations would still be allowed in the provincial capitals. A meeting for top leaders to criticize Lin Biao began later that day, with Marshals Chen Yi, Nie Rongjung, Xu Xiangqian, and other veteran PLA officers in attendance. On September 28th, a central directive limited documents on Lin Biao's flight and death to top leaders like provincial standing committee members and generals. The public was not allowed to know of Lin's death yet. Damage control was still paramount. On that same day, Lin Liguo associate Wang Fei wrote a confession, claiming to have been showed a paper order from Lin Biao to accept commands from Zhou Yuqi, this infamous supposed 571 plot document. The next day, the 29th, a confidential memo informed leaders that Wang Yongsheng, Li Zuopeng, Wu Faxiang, and Chu Huizhuo had been sacked for conspiring with Lin Biao. On September 30th, English-language newspaper digest Peking Review carried an advertisement for Lin Biao's speeches. Radio Fujian advertised a Mao Lin photo album. Literally, the entirety of the Chinese public was none the wiser. Everything seemed hunky-dory at the top, and people just assumed that Lin was still working hard alongside Chairman Mao to serve the people and make revolution. However, that day, Mongolia's press agency publicly announced the September 13th air crash to its own people and said that the PLA plane must have lost its bearing while flying at night. The Politburo agreed staffing arrangements for a Lin Biao Chenboda inquiry, along with personnel changes in various arms of the Ministry of Defense. October rolled around and autumn of 1971 came. The People's Daily welcomed National Day with a long article detailing various statistics indicating China had begun experiencing a good amount of economic growth that year, along with an article calling for U.S. aggressive troops to leave Korea and criticizing the USA's imperialist voting machine of allies at the UN. On October 3rd, an awkward broadcast occurred. Radio Hubei described Lin Biao, using the usual formulation, as an shining example to follow. However, literally every other national, provincial, and municipal station had begun to cease mentioning him, with many radio staff not knowing why they'd been ordered to. That same day in Beijing, a central directive informed leaders that a Lin Biao Chenboda inquiry had been set up, to be led day to day by Ji Donghui and Wang Dongxing. The Central Military Commission's administrative group was declared thereby dissolved and replaced by a new organ headed by Ye Jianying and run by Li Deshang. Further reshuffling occurred, and a notice revealed that Hua Guofeng was to join the State Council's business group, running the government day to day as its new deputy leader. In the early evening, foreign ministry officials gathered in the ministry's main auditorium, where the notice on Lin Biao's flight and death was read out. The next day, over in the U.S., Time magazine speculated about Lin Biao's absence from view and hypothesized that Wang Yongsheng may be after his job as defense minister. Back in Beijing, Mao received members of Ye Jianying's new Central Military Commission office, informing them that Lin Biao and Chen Boda had conspired to seize power and blamed the two for the treatment of PLA leaders in the late 1960s. On October 5th, Xinhua news agency announced that Kissinger would visit China again later in the month to make concrete arrangements for President Nixon's trip. That same day, Zhou Enlai and Geng Biao received 70 visiting Americans, including the leaders of the Revolutionary Union, Black Panthers, and Young Lords Party. Included in this group were notable American communists such as Huey P. Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, Bobby Seale, Bob Avakian, Mary Lou Greenberg, H. Bruce Franklin, C. Clark Kissinger, and many, many more. However, as Zhou was entertaining these American comrades, a new limited circulation memo informed top leaders that Lin Biao tried to have Mao assassinated and set up a rival government in the South before he fled. A week later, the Communist Party of China declined Hoxha's invitation to the upcoming Labor Party Congress, following 1969's blanket policy against such delegation. Hoxha was, according to later sources, furious and said that the Chinese would regret their anti-Marxist snub toward him. On October 20th, Kissinger and his entourage arrived in Beijing, greeted by Ye Jianying and Ji Pengfei. They joined Zhou Enlai and his interpreters for talks. After the meeting, Mao summoned Zhou Enlai, Ye Jianying, Ji Pengfei, and the meeting's interpreters Wang Hairong and Tong Wensheng to discuss Kissinger. Ye Jianying said that the timing of Kissinger's visit suggested that the USA knew that the next week's UN motion to seat the PRC would fail. After more talks on the 23rd, Mao criticized a draft communique for the Kissinger talks for lacking a voice. He felt it avoided saying anything about revolution or oppression. The next day, Ji Denghui read Kissinger a revised draft communique. Kissinger was irked by it, saying that the sharp, uncompromising language made it hard to accept. On October 25th, at the UN headquarters, an American motion to let Beijing assume the UN China seat with Taipei keeping a seat of its own was voted down by the General Assembly. Instead, the UN General Assembly passed the Albanian motion to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek and exclusively seat the PRC. Surprised by Chiang Kai-shek and America's defeat at the UN, Mao commented that China had been carried into the UN by its brothers in the Third World. And it was true. When the vote showed that the People's Republic was to take over the China seat at the UN, it is said that the African and Arab delegates danced in the aisles with joy. November rolled around and Kim Il-sung arrived in Beijing for his second visit in China just over a year, so that he and Mao could discuss the Kissinger talks. At the talks, Mao brought together his new ad hoc foreign policy group, Zhou Enlai, Ye Jianying, Ji Pengfei, Chao Guanhua, and Wang Hairong. Upon returning to Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung reassured Workers' Party of Korea cadres that China engaging with Nixon was no big deal. It was just like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. The next day, Foreign Ministry official Huang Hua, who would soon become deputy head of China's UN mission, signed a mutual agreement with Peru, which is funny because at the same time, Beijing was actually training Communist Party of Peru members in studying military theory and agricultural reform. And on the 3rd, the Foreign Ministry threw a bountiful banquet in Beijing for the diplomatic representatives of nations who voted the PRC into the UN the prior month. On October 6th, in a Jiangxi factory dining hall, for over 2 hours, 80 workers, including Deng Xiaoping, were read the circular revealing Lin Biao's death. Deng Xiaoping contributed no views on Lin in his workshop's discussion group, but he was allowed to take the text of the circular home. Deng wrote to Mao that he had always thought Chen Boda was a villain, but was genuinely shocked and angered to learn of Lin's betrayal. Thanks to The brilliant leadership foiling Lin Biao and Chen Boda, Deng Xiaoping continued in his letter that he was so happy he could not restrain his emotions. 2 days later, work on getting ready to join the UN continued. Mao approved a report saying that China should make sure to be consultative at the UN and avoid using its Security Council veto too much. Mao also rejected British overtures to diplomatic recognition. Unlike the Americans who were ready to compromise, the Brits were trying to remain equivocal on Taiwan, so Mao decided to keep them in timeout. Zhou Enlai, Ye, Zhang, and Wang, and other top cadres then saw Chao Guanhua off to the airport as he flew to join the UN in New York. On November 11th, a Scottish Council for Development and Industry group arrived in Guangzhou. They were the first Western European trade delegation since the 1950s. And while Chao Guanhua arrived in New York, he told journalists that he wished well people of all walks of life in New York and the rest of America. Future President George H.W. Bush greeted the PRC UN delegation on the way to the main chamber. There, they took the China seat and heard other nations' remarks. On October 15th, Chao addressed the UN. He attacked the USA, thanked those who helped seat the PRC, and talked about history's trend towards revolution. So, quite the introduction. On November 18th, on local radio, Hangzhou's top PLA officer alluded to Lin Biao's clique exhibiting left-wing extremism and delusions of intellectual grandeur. On November 20th, receiving Wuhan military leaders, Mao repudiated Lin Biao's ideological contributions, but said that his followers could be rehabilitated. Mao also said that it was worth retaining the 8 democratic parties of the United Front. For more info on this, please see our mini-sode on the United Front parties during the Cultural Revolution. In Nanjing, party leaders met to pick through and correct forced confessions extracted during investigations into the supposed May 16th group. Investigations led by PLA officials aligned with Lin Biao. A few days later, Hainan Radio celebrated the end of a nameless clique of party enemies whose bodies and bones were scattered without ever finding a grave. On November 29th, the Politburo ruled that Mao's 4 great titles, Great Leader, Great Teacher, Great Commander, and Great Helmsman, which Lin Biao had coined, were not to be used anymore in any party publications or state media. On December 1st, People's Daily shared an editorial on summing up experiences and reminded party committees that hidden anti-party elements were actually very rare, and to be careful not to whip up conspiratorial ideas or attack people without firm evidence. On December 6th, Zhou Enlai told the Military Aviation Industry Forum that it was time to criticize Lin Biao and his anti-party group for anarchism and ultra-leftism. 10 days later, the State Council's National Planning Conference began discussing the economic plan for 1972 and criticized the economics of Lin Biao. The next day, on the 17th, a central directive listed the approvals needed to remove officials if they ended up being implicated by investigations into Lin or Chen. On December 22nd, China's UN delegation returned from New York. Zhou Enlai met them at the airport and they all reported to Mao together in the evening. And a few days later, People's Daily evaluated the UN 26th General Assembly as a victory for the oppressed peoples of the world. And with that, we will end our chronicle of the year 1971. So, anyways, let's address the elephant in the room. What do we make of the Lin Biao incident? Well, scholars are still to this day heavily divided on the issue, so I'll present the 2 main arguments put forward, or should I say 2.5. First, there is the prevailing school of thought in official Chinese discourse and among Maoist groups more globally that Lin was, quote, left in form, right in essence, and that Mao was indeed the target of a coup by Lin. There is strong evidence for this position. Lin had not only carefully read Liu Shaoqi's famous How to Be a Good Communist and made many approving marginal comments during the Cultural Revolution, he also told Lin Duoduo that Liu Shaoqi's level of theoretical understanding was superior to Mao's, and he declared that both Liu and Deng Xiaoping were good comrades, and commented that it did not make sense to get rid of Liu. As for the Cultural Revolution itself, Lin made a dismissive comment in 1967 that the movement had become a revolution without culture, and this perhaps best summed up his attitude. A secret disdain for the entire thing while still claiming to be its second in command. At least, that's what his daughter says. Mao said many times in meetings with the Central Military Commission across 1971 that he was concerned that the PLA had a disproportionate amount of power in the provincial and municipal revolutionary committees, and that it was time for the party and mass organizations to give more play to their own initiative in these new bodies of power. Lin, according to later accounts by his colleagues and daughters, felt deeply upset by this, and his son Lin Liguo and his wife Ye Chun even more so. Lin did indeed have every reason to pull off a coup if he wanted his political trajectory to continue, especially after the Lushan Conference of 1970 split Mao and Lin irreparably. His fanatical and dogmatic loyalty to Mao, which often manifested in promoting book worship and blind obedience to authority, had caused issues in society and simultaneously had not paid off for Lin. He certainly felt sidelined and betrayed, despite still officially being Mao's successor. In 1980, the Communist Party of China put forward the summation that Lin Biao's clique and the clique around the Gang of Four had collaborated to sabotage Chairman Mao and the party center, only falling out with each other in 1971 when Lin's coup attempt was exposed. The Maoist camp within the international communist movement by and large takes up a variation of this theory, albeit not looping in the Gang of Four into the conspiracy. The Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, an international conference of Maoist parties, upheld the idea that Lin was responsible for an attempt to assassinate Mao, and that he fled when the plot was exposed. Bob Avakian, chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party USA, said in his 1979 book Mao Zedong's Immortal Contributions that, quote, Mao recognized quite early that Lin Biao had treacherous characteristics, even though he had played a generally positive role at an earlier stage in the Chinese Revolution, and even though Mao felt it was necessary to unite with Lin during the first stage of the Cultural Revolution in order to knock out the strongly entrenched rightists associated with Liu Shaoqi, end quote. Avakian goes on to say that there had been, quote, many defects in the way in which Lin had promoted the Cultural Revolution, and by the time of the Ninth Congress he had begun to attack many of the achievements and gains of the Cultural Revolution, and that he had argued that revolutionary turmoil was fine for a while, namely for as long as it took for him to get to the top, but that the time had come for the masses to quiet down, put the noses to the grindstone, and just engage in production, end quote. It was due to this, Avakian and other Maoist leaders during the 1970s and 1980s argued that Lin wanted Mao out of the picture. This continues to be the general consensus among Maoist parties today. However, some Western scholars have cited differences with these narratives. One of the most prominent dissident voices is the scholar Frederick Hughes. In his book, The Tragedy of Lin Biao, he posits the following 6-point evaluation. Number 1. Far from being excessively ambitious, Lin was content with an inactive albeit honored position and was thrust into a leading role by Mao and subsequently cast aside for reasons that have little to do with any wishes he may have had for greater power. This view was strongly expressed in the immediate post-Lin period. Under the influence of post-Mao Chinese accounts of the struggle of the Lin Biao and Jiangqing cliques, more recent Western analysis have given greater attention to conflict between the two groups. Number 2. While Lin publicly assumed a proponent's role during the Cultural Revolution as befitted his new status as the successor, and also seemingly took advantage of the situation to settle personal grievances, to the extent that a personal political orientation can be deduced from his actions and private statements, it was in favor of economic and moderation and limiting chaos, particularly in the army. 3. Lin never opposed Mao politically, but instead operated by the prime political rule of strictly following the chairman's wishes to the extent that they could be determined. Even in the desperate post-Liu Shan period, his posture was passive and most likely, although not certainly, Q says, he had no knowledge of any military coup or assassination plots. 4. There was no fundamental conflict between Lin and Zhou Enlai, as Zhou accepted Lin's superior status, and Lin did not interfere in Zhou's activities. The conflict which did exist was between Lin and his supporters and Jiang Qing's group, which fundamentally developed from competition for Mao's blessing and was concerned more with trivial matters and perceptions of relative power than with policy issues. 5. Although the relationship of civilian and military authority caused considerable friction within the party, there is little to suggest that Lin or his top associates in the PLA were pushing for a Bonapartist outcome. And finally, 6. While Lin did have an interest in the institutional well-being of the military and the PLA as an organization, playing a key role in supervising the economy, there is no evidence of his shaping a coherent program to appeal to a military-industrial complex, or indeed of any developed policy positions through the entire 1966 through 1971 period." End quote. So quite a sharp contrast to what the official Chinese and broader communist movement globally say. Things get more confusing when we find out that Zhang Yongsheng, who served as Lin Biao's receptionist from August 66 to late 1970, testified later that Lin was not only a man of little ambition, but was a detached, introverted figure who usually showed little interest in national or world affairs and seldom played an active role in policy making. Clearly, poor health was a major factor, with Lin rarely attending important meetings, only able to work for 1 or 2 30-minute periods per day when he was briefed by his secretaries, requiring injections of sedatives before public appearances because he was such a nervous, neurotic little man. Other veteran revolutionaries testify that Ye Chun, who saw her role as guarding the pass, controlled access to Lin Biao and was easily able to manipulate him, a fact which often makes it almost impossible to know when actions reflected Lin's will or whether they were a product of Ye's initiatives. Well, 2 final questions about the Lin Biao incident remain unanswered. Why did the plane eventually turn north towards the Soviet Union? And how did the plane crash? Before Lin's family left building number 96 for the airport, Ye Chun and Lin Liguo had mentioned going to Dalian, Guangzhou, or even Hong Kong, but no one had ever heard them say a word about going to the Soviet Union. People sympathetic to Lin Biao have indulged in much speculation. Some people believe that the reason Lin's plane turned northward had much to do with Zhou Enlai's order to ground all planes, which was an order that would have effectively closed all airports. It was thus impossible for the plane to land in China, even if the pilot had intended to return to the airport. According to 2 Air Force officers that Hughes interviewed, however, Captain Pan made no attempt to contact an airport. The pilot shut off the communication system after the plane had taken off. In Li's account, he did not realize that the Lins were going to betray the country until he heard himself, Lin, ask Lin Liguo in the car on the way to the airport how far away would Irkutsk be. During the next few seconds, Li was torn over what to do. Finally, he realized what was happening. Everything Lin Dodo had told him was suddenly clear, and he realized that the group was heading for the Soviet Union. Torn between loyalty to his master and the well-being of his own family, Li asked himself what would happen to his wife and children if he were to be labeled a traitor to the country. He dared not think along that line. Li's later report to the special case group that Lin had asked in the car about the distance to Irkutsk is the sole piece of evidence indicating that Lin knew they were going to the Soviet Union. Hughes thus postulates that there is no other evidence to corroborate Li's testimony on this point. So where was Lin Biao going to? Well, honestly, we may never truly know. Ye was still talking about going to Dalian or Guangzhou the next morning. Other than the offhand comment about going to Irkutsk, Lin himself never mentioned anything to anyone about going anywhere besides Dalian. Even Lin Wenpu, Lin's trusted bodyguard, believed Lin was going to Dalian or Guangzhou until the car left for the airport around midnight. What they would do there, only they would know, and we are left with more questions than answers. But what about Project 571? Central Investigation Group for Special Cases, organized for the Lin Biao incident, also confirmed that when his father presented the newly discovered outline of Project 571 to Mao and Zhou Enlai, Mao did not believe at all that it was Lin Biao's plan, but later changed his mind. Furthermore, the notebook copy of the alleged plan reads more like a political proclamation than a plan for a coup. Only 2 of its 9 parts discuss the use of force. The parts concerning politics are far more interesting than those concerned with the military aspects of the coup. Many of those documents' criticisms of Mao and the Cultural Revolution appear to anticipate those made after Mao's death. In fact, the outline contains one of the earliest criticisms of the Cultural Revolution. Whoever drafted the plan had limited knowledge of military tactics and organization. For example, the basic strengths of the conspirators were said to be in the 4th and 5th Air Force Armies, the 9th, 18th, and 34th Air Force Divisions, the 21st Tank Regiment, and strangely, the Civil Aeronautics Administration? Thus, the estimate of the author of the plot that was no more than half a military dozen units would support the coup. It is difficult to imagine that Lin, who had commanded 1 million troops and had intricate knowledge of the requirements of any military situation, would accept such an estimate of forces as sufficient to carry out a coup. It is equally doubtful that Lin would have relied so heavily on the Air Force to ensure success. Even the author of the outline notes that, at the present, the preparation of our strength is still not adequate. Given Lin's military record, one might reasonably have expected him to do a much better job of planning a military action against Mao. Further, the language in the outline is not what Lin would have used. Judging from their dogged loyalty to Mao over 3 decades of struggle against their common enemies, it is difficult to imagine that Lin or anyone else in the generation of old revolutionaries would have referred to Mao by the code name B-52. Indeed, the outline is peppered with distinctive, unclear codes. The Chinese characters in the title contain 571, a homonym for military uprising. The author repeats 571 in the document numerous times, beating a dead horse. 571 appears at least 4 times in the opening page, for example. Other codes like B-52, the Pen, the Fleet, Battleship 5, the Chief, etc. keep appearing. Such codes have no military or security use, but do give the outline a certain, James Bond quality. The outline is more akin to a spy novel or a screenplay than a real military document. Again, this gives the outline a very sophomorish quality. If the document is indeed real, it almost certainly wasn't written by Lin Biao directly, but by his son Li Guo and allies closer to his age or younger. It uses a lot of colloquialisms and highly emotional language common to Lin Jr.'s personal correspondences, but never found in Lin Sr.'s personal correspondence or notes. Many Chinese scholars, including those that I've spoken to here in China, feel that the 571 document's writing style doesn't match that of Lin Biao, but is very close to Lin Li Guo's. The military planning in the Project 571 document is incredibly amateurish and reckless, and seems more like something a hotshot rookie officer might up with rather than a seasoned, shrewd field marshal who helped lead a revolutionary people's war. Finally, we have to look at the physical copy of the 571 document itself. It was written in the handwriting of Yu Xinye, the deputy director of the Air Force Party Committee Office and a close friend and subordinate of Lin Guo. Yu, it should be noted, was often at odds with Lin Sr. According to the confessions of Li Weixin, the only member of the Joint Fleet who survived long enough to be captured and interrogated, the document was brainstormed and drafted in Shanghai in March 1971 by Lin Guo, Yu Xinye, and himself, with Lin not being present. No physical evidence, draft, or audio recording was ever produced linking Lin Biao's handwriting or voice to the creation, approval, or even awareness of the document. Of course, just because Lin didn't write it doesn't mean he wasn't in on it, but at this point, we may never truly know. The Lin Biao incident is a great historical mystery that may never be fully unraveled, mainly because those who were involved took their secrets with them to their graves. All the documentation they left us doesn't help clear things up, and other than eyewitness testimony, we don't have much in the way of documentation of what went on that night or what their plans were. Even after all the research I did for this episode, I still find myself with more questions than I do answers. I don't know. What do you think, listeners? Was Lin Biao a part of the coup plot to kill Chairman Mao? Or do you think he was a helpless patsy caught in the crossfire of his overly ambitious son and wife? I'd love to hear what you think. But until then, this is your host Drew signing off from the illustrious capital of Beijing. Tune in to our next episode where we'll be dealing with another meaty and difficult subject, the Nixon and Mao meeting of 1972. So with that, let's put a bookmark in our book and let's give you guys a big zaijian. See you in September. Sources for today's episode include The Culture of Power, The Lin Biao Incident and the Cultural Revolution by Jin Qiu, The Tragedy of Lin Biao, Riding the Tiger During the Cultural Revolution by Frederick C. Tews and Warren Sun, Mao's Last Revolution by Roderick McFarquhar and Michael Schoenhals, Turbulent Decade, A History of the Cultural Revolution by Yan Chia-Chi and Gao Gao, The World Turned Upside Down, A History of the Cultural Revolution by Yang Jisheng, the full text of the 571 Project Summary, transcribed by Zheng Weiguo, Marxist Internet Archive Peking Review Archive, Marxist Internet Archive Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism Online, the People's Daily Archives, Shanxi Provincial Archives, the Wilson Center Archives, the Chinese University of Hong Kong Cultural Revolution Database, Regarding the September 13th Incident by Mao Yanxin, Chairman Mao on the September 13th Incident by Mao Yanxin, Mao Zedong's Immortal Contributions by Bob Avakian, and the China History Podcast episodes number 362 and 363, the Lin Biao Incidents Parts 1 and 2 by Laszlo Montgomery. All right, have a great day, guys. 江河。